Hello everyone, welcome to this first video in a series about homeschooling that we're going to publish on this channel. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel for more information and more videos which I hope will be helpful for you. Some parents have chosen to put their children into homeschooling for philosophical or even political reasons. Some parents choose to put their children into homeschooling for financial reasons. All of those are perfectly valid. There are parents even who have been forced to put their children into homeschooling for medical reasons. In some countries, if you do not have your children vaccinated against measles, then the school system will not allow them to go to a normal mainstream school. So they have no option but to homeschool them. So homeschooling really means a whole lot of different things to a whole lot of different people. At one end of the spectrum, there is homeschooling, which is very similar to traditional school. The difference being the child is not in the school building, they're in the home, and the teacher is not the teacher, but the teacher is actually the parent or somebody who is working with the child at home. That is a model of homeschooling which is most similar to traditional homeschooling, and in some ways is the easiest to deal with. But even with that, there are big differences. The main one being that the amount of teaching time that a child receives is very high compared to being in a traditional school. If you imagine your child going to a traditional school, let's say for 5 hours in the day, and there are 25 children in the class, if you've ever done the calculation, that means that the child is likely to get on average 12 minutes of teacher time in a day, 12 minutes only. Because 5 hours divided by 25 children gives you 12 minutes per child. And I'm including lunchtime and break time and all of that in there. So really, when a child is being educated at home, that's one of the things that we must think about very carefully, is the amount of time. Because if a child is going to go from being educated for 12 minutes a day with one-to-one instruction to being educated for, let's say, 3 or 4 hours a day with one-to-one instruction, that's a very big change. And we would encourage you, we'll talk in further videos later, about how you actually timetable the amount of time that your child needs at a particular age. Because obviously it's different if your child is 3 or 4, your child is 13 or 14, or your child is 17 or 18. There's going to be different amounts of time because of the different types of curriculum that they're offered. So curriculum is another issue. Some parents will take the ministry's curriculum, or in our case, many parents will choose the British national curriculum, the English national curriculum, or they'll choose the Filipino national curriculum, and use that as the backbone for their teaching. And that's really what you need to think of a curriculum as being. It's a backbone for the education system. It's not something that needs to drive everything that happens. It's not necessary to follow slavishly what it says in any textbook or national curriculum document from any country. Even though some schools do that, there are types of education, Sabishwefat, for example, that has a structure, a curriculum that is followed, and it's followed very strictly. And many parents like that because it's straightforward to understand, and it often relates quite closely to what their own education system was when they were at school. But more progressive systems are looking more to do with involving children in learning skills rather than learning knowledge. If your child has been in an Indian curriculum school, CBSE and the other major examination boards have in the past been very big on knowledge, facts, and that's a particular way of learning that has to be followed if you're going to do that at home. But even those countries and those curricula, the international CBSE curriculum, for example, is much more strongly focused on skills now than it is on facts, and that's a totally different type of education. That's a totally different type of education. So imagine you're starting homeschooling for the first time. It's day one. What advice can we give you? Honestly, a friend of ours who works in Romania, the advice that she gives to families who are starting homeschooling for the first time is relax. Just that, relax. Don't get stressed. Don't try and copy what was happening in school. You have to figure out your own way of educating your children. And the children have a really big part to play in that. Now that's another issue I want to talk about. We've already talked about homeschooling in a very traditional school sort of way, but the other end of the spectrum, right at the other extreme, are those families who decide that they don't want any system at all in their education. They will trust the child, they trust their child to decide what activities they're going to do. Now, that's an extreme position as well, and many people would say, yes, but my son would just play Fortnite all day. And people who believe in that type of homeschool, or they would call it unschool, or no school, they would say, yes, if your child wants to play Fortnite all day, then that's exactly what he or she should do. It's not a problem for them because they believe that sooner or later the child will discover something more interesting that they want to do. Now, the vast majority of families are somewhere in between those two extreme positions. So the advice that we're going to give is really based on people who are somewhere in the middle of the continuum. We will have some extra videos separately shot on unschooling and no schooling, but the vast majority of the videos on this channel will be more to do with people who are homeschooling because they believe that that is the right thing to do, or because actually they have no choice, as we do at the moment. Certainly for this semester, this video is being shot in April 2020. It looks as if the homeschooling enforced distance learning will be running at least until June, and then we're hoping things will be back to normal in September, but nobody knows. Now, the sort of system that's set up at the moment from the schools in this country and many other countries is not really homeschooling, it's distance learning. And there is an important difference between those two. In distance learning, the vast majority of schools operating distance learning models at the moment are requiring the children, for example, to be at their computers at 8 o'clock in the morning, and they expect them to be there until 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Obviously there are some breaks, but basically they're supposed to be seated there just like they would be in school. That's a very understandable model because it's very close to what happens in a mainstream school. But it's not homeschooling. Homeschooling is much more relaxed than that. If you want to take a question that I'm often asked when we speak to groups of parents, sometimes the parents will say, do I need to give up my job in order for my child to be homeschooled? The answer, of course, is no. You absolutely don't need to give up your job. Somebody needs to be available to look after your child, but they do not need to be being educated between 8 o'clock and 2 o'clock, 8 o'clock in the morning and 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Just not necessary. It's entirely up to you what time and what hours you operate with your child in terms of their education. You may decide, because you're working, that you're going to do hardly any education during the week and that most of the education is going to happen at the weekend. That's fine. You're turning things around and making it suit you, because that surely is one of the big advantages of homeschooling, is that you can tailor the education to much more closely match the needs of the child. And really that's something that all school systems should be doing, whether they're traditional or private or government. All of us should be trying very hard to tailor the system so that it better meets the needs of the child. So a few things for you to consider. I'm not saying that I have all the answers. Sometimes I think I have all the questions, but I'll try and give you my advice in terms of answers as well. What are the things that you need to be thinking about if you decide to bring your child into homeschooling rather than distance learning? And remember that distance learning is run by the traditional school, home learning is run by a non-traditional training organisation and can be run by yourself. You need to be very, very organised if you're going to be doing homeschooling. It's very, very clear that the planning and so on has to come from you. Even if the child, as we would suggest, is very much involved in it, ultimately you need to be controlling what's happening in terms of homeschooling. In terms of whether or not to decide to bring your child into homeschool. It's very, very important that you seek high quality, personalised educational programme, and the responsibility for that, if you're homeschooling, rests quite a lot with you, not just with any accrediting body. For example, with FilBrit we have accredited programmes for the Filipino curriculum and the British national curriculum, or the English national curriculum, and both of those are validated by external bodies, In the UK, we have the national curriculum published by the government, so it's very clear what a child should be doing. In the Philippines, there's a different system where the curriculum has to be organised and monitored by a named school in the Philippines, and there's a very small number of schools that are allowed to do that. And it's very important that the child's education is fully validated in that way, because you never know, maybe at some stage you will want to drop your child back into traditional school, because there are advantages to traditional schooling, certainly in terms of sociability and friends. One of the complaints that we hear from our kids at the moment in this sudden distance learning because of COVID-19 is that it's not really very much fun. It's very much more difficult to have fun if you're sitting in front of a computer from 8 o'clock in the morning until 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And that's something that as a parent, if you decide to homeschool, then you need to consider. Homeschooling should be fun. It should not be desperately hard work all the time. Maybe there will be times when you will have to work hard, but most of the time you should be having fun. The person who's working with the child should be having fun. And finally, just before we've finish this video, I wanted to say something about the age of the child. It's really, really important that you consider the age and stage of your child before making a decision to homeschool. If your child is in what we call the early years, let's say 3-year-old, 4-year-old, 5-year-old, there's still a lot of time, a lot of flexibility in their educational career. So you have time and you don't need to be stressed about it. It's also more difficult because you cannot expect a 3-year-old to sit in front of a computer screen for a very length of time. So the program has to be much more chopped up into short, sharp bursts and with lots of rests and fun in between. Now the same applies whatever the child is, but in general, the closer the child gets to the age of 16 or the age of 18, when they're heading towards externally moderated examinations, the more serious the education has to become. Assuming that you want your child to take those external examinations, say for kids in the British curriculum, they will probably take IGCSE or A-levels. Those examinations can be sat in schools. For example, FilBrit has partner schools who agree to allow our kids to take the GCSEs in the other school building, and that works very well indeed. But it is something to consider. It's even more complicated. Imagine if you have a 4-year-old and a 14-year-old. They're going to need separate spaces and separate programs for the way that their homeschool is going to run. So I hope we've covered a number of the general questions that you might have. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel and join us the next time we publish a video, which will be very shortly. I hope that's been useful and answered some of your questions at least. Following me, there'll be a screen which shows you links to our website, to the YouTube channel, which I hope you'll subscribe to, and to our Facebook account and our Instagram account. All of them will have slightly different information, links coming about, which should be helpful for you. Okay, I hope to see you again soon.